Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to get us started here. I want to thank you all for attending this event. My name is Elizabeth Schiltz. I'm a professor at the School of Law. I am the co-director of the Terence J. Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought, Law, and Public Policy. The Institute is a joint venture between the Center for Catholic Studies and the School of Law. I am the co-director representing the law school, and Billy Junker, who is sitting over there, is the co-director from the Center for Catholic Studies. The Murphy Institute is dedicated to engaging the community and the academic world in conversations about issues of policy that are of interest or importance to the thought of the Catholic world. We do it through many fora and in many different ways, but this program is part of our series called Hot Topics, Cool Talk, in which we have hour-long, pretty focused conversations about issues that either are issues that Catholic thinkers have divergent views about, or that Catholic thought has something to say about, and not necessarily unanimity about. And we try to center around hot topics. And today's program is no exception. We're going to be looking at the issue of backpack journalism and mission trips, and thinking about the theological considerations that should guide our when we embark on such journeys. We have a great, wonderful group of panelists today, or people that will engage in the debate. Each of them will talk a little bit, and they'll have a chance to talk to each other, and then we'll take questions from the audience, and we'll have microphones that we'll be handing around. But my job now is just to introduce our moderator for today's event, Chris Thompson. He is Associate Professor of Moral Theology and Director for the Center of Theological Formation at the St. Paul Seminary School of Divinity. He has taught, he teaches in areas of moral theology, rural ministry, and integral ecology, and has written in all of those areas as well. He is also president of the International Catholic Rural Association, and he spent a number of years teaching, and 3 years as head of the Center for Catholic Studies, and will be kind of coming back to the Center for Catholic Studies this summer, taking over as my co-director of the Murphy Institute. So I'll leave you in his hands.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I am Chris Thompson from the St. Paul Seminary School of Divinity, and let me start by thanking Catholic Studies and the School of Law for giving me the privilege to step in as co-director of the Murphy Institute in the coming years. It's a little intimidating to follow in the footsteps of Billy Junker, but I will give it my best. But it's a great honor. One of the tasks of co-director is to introduce the speakers, and I know we want to get into the subject, and so I'd like to just move to that if I could. Today we're going to talk about this issue of mission trips and service trips, and for those of you, I'm presuming most of you who have had these kinds of experiences, know that they can be life-changing experiences. You encounter something completely unexpected, and it changes you almost inevitably for the better, despite the unsettling moments of the experience. That's precisely was that question of, well, is that really the fruit? Is the point of the mission trip simply my own exposure and edification? Is the point of the mission trip just simply one more consumer experience I tick off on the bucket list, so to speak, and thus the title? It's a great question, and we're especially blessed to have two really gifted thinkers who have a long history and experience in these questions. John O'Keefe is professor of theology at Creighton University. I have to say in Omaha, Nebraska. I guess everybody knows where Creighton is, but I'll say in Omaha, Nebraska. And is the founding director of the Center for Catholic Thought. I have to also confess a certain jealousy for such a short title for your organization. The Terence J. Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought, Law, and Public Policy. I'm now co-director, and she mentioned I'm the Center for Theological Formation at the St. Paul Seminary School of Divinity at the University of St. Thomas. So when I saw Center for Catholic Thought, that sounded intriguing. So Dr. O'Keefe is involved in documentary filmmaking projects that explore the mission of the church in the developing world. He's also, along with his wife, a member of the Ignatian Associates, lay organization dedicated to living the principles of Ignatian spirituality. Not only a talented teacher and filmmaker, but I think we can say a deeply committed and faithful scholar as well, and it's a privilege to have you join us. Professor O'Keefe will speak first, before, though, right after my introduction of Gerald, and then we'll move right into it. Equally impressive in terms of talent and depth is Gerald Schlabach, professor of theology here at our own university, and former chair of the Department of Justice and Peace Studies, in addition to many books and articles on the themes of social justice and service. He's the 2012 Service Learning Faculty Award winner here at the University of St. Thomas. Dr. Schlabach has led students on mission trips for over 18 years and is a true servant in the area and a thought leader in helping all of us draw deeper connections between social ethics, the church, and mission. With the introductions out of the way, I will step aside and hand the floor over to our esteemed colleagues. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Sean, and for picking me up at the airport, and Chris and Lisa for your kind introductions. And that's
it's
the wrong.
advancing. I don't know.
It's going by itself.
It's going by itself.
Okay.
Let me go back here. I think that's maybe why these were hide.
I never use PowerPoint. I use Keynote.
Okay. I think that's why they were hidden.
Okay.
Is there anybody here who's super fast?
I'm going to stop my timer.
Okay. Yep. There you go.
Okay.
Let's try that.
Sorry?
Let's see.
Well, we could always just run it. If we just run it from here, so it doesn't look as good, but who cares,
Okay, that's
right?
fine.
So I'll just roll with it. All right. So we'll just.
But you need to.
I need
you
to get to
start
my.
it.
Well, if we started at my autoplay, that's what I'm worried about. You want to try it?
Mm-hmm. There you go.
All right. So we'll try again.
No, it's
So-
not
Okay. All right, so we won't autoplay. I'll do it this way. It won't look as good, but you'll get the
Okay.
gist. Okay. So thanks, Lisa and Chris, for your kind introduction, and thanks all of you for coming today. Again, my name is John O'Keefe. I'm professor of theology at Creighton University, and I want to just say a little bit about my background before I tell you about backpack journalism and the immersion trip that I've been running for coming up on 10 years now. My training is in patristic theology, which is really ancient Christianity, and so I spent most of my early career studying the development of Christian doctrine. I was especially interested in the development of scriptural interpretation, of the Christological controversies in the 5th century. But I went to Africa in 2008, just with some friends who were working over there running an NGO, and it had a really big impact on me, and I came back and I thought, what am I going to do in response to that experience? And I happened to be having coffee with a colleague from the journalism department who had worked closely with on some other projects, and I had recently been named an endowed chair which is a long story I won't get into, but I had some resources basically. And I said, what if we did a filmmaking project that was sort of a combination of theology and journalism, and we took people to places on earth that were challenged, and tried to tell the story of the church's work there. And she said, great idea, let's do it. And so we did. And the result of that was backpack journalism. I'll say just a little bit about the phrase backpack journalism. It's really easy to misunderstand what this means. It kind of is unfortunate because it conjures people wearing backpacks and going out into the wilderness. In fact, during one of our early projects, the student health presentation that was mandatory for our students, the nurse said, make sure you wear high boots to keep away from, snake bites and things. And that's not what backpack journalism is. What it really refers to is the size of equipment that can fit into a backpack. So until relatively recently, the kind of filmmaking that we're doing would have cost $500,000, and you'd need a moving truck to take care of all your equipment. But it's gotten so sophisticated and so small that you can create cinema quality productions with about a $10,000 investment. All right. So this guy, Bill Gentile, claims to have coined the term backpack journalism. That's somewhat contested, but I'm going with it. So we came up with this project, backpack journalism, which I like to say the short description of this is social justice journalism, okay? Informed by Catholic social teaching is the sort of short way of introducing that. I also like to call it kind of going to the margins. The Jesuits like to claim this for themselves. I'm sure it's not just a Jesuit thing, but it's certainly an emphasis of the Jesuits in recent years as to that we want to pay attention to the poor people, the poorest folks around the world, and give them a certain kind of privileged attention, okay? We sometimes talk about that as the option for the poor. We're also interested in just bearing witness to their stories and surfacing stories that are sometimes not told. And then, to the extent possible, advocating for these people. That can be difficult, but what our form of advocacy is to leave behind an artifact, a film, something they can use as part of their story. One time one of our films we used as a fundraiser, and the next year we went back to the same village and did another film, and we asked them what they needed, and this was in East Africa, and they said, well, what we really need is some oxen and a plow, which I would never have thought of, but we managed to leverage a screening of the film into a fundraiser for an ox team and a plow for those folks. So we try to pay attention to these things. Now, at the same time, there is sorry. I thought I'd show you a trailer of our most recent project, just so you get a flavor for it.
The challenge of our migration policy and other policies is that they're driven by fear.
Talk to most Border Patrol agents or detention agents, and they find it very difficult to do that job if they see this as real human beings.
They become objects or statistics.
Obviously, the U.S. has a right to protect its border, as any nation does, but that right is not at the expense of human dignity.
That we have unnecessarily put people in a situation where they're going to die is horrible, and that they're out there thinking, oh my God, here I thought I was going to save my family with money, and I'm going to die out here.
Esa humillación que propicia el sistema de decir, tú no vales, tú no mereces, tú eres inferior.
It's what we really do to the least of us that defines us.
The only law is love your neighbor. And you tell me how putting up a wall is loving your neighbor.
You really can't build a wall against hope, because hope is one of the few things that we as humans hold on to.
No pierdo las esperanzas de un día verlo, un día abrazarlo, jugar con él.
So that film is obviously about migration and our border policies, and that was our most recent project, which we did 2 years ago. We're starting our 6th project right now. But the issue that really we wrestle with, and I think is the main focus of our conversation today, is this in some ways, despite our highest ambitions, a form of exploitation. And I read some years ago this really interesting work by Susan Sontag on photography, where she talks about the power of photography to really take advantage of people, or the danger of it. So the example is photography, you don't want to make ugly photographs or ugly movies. So what does it mean to be photographing suffering and making it beautiful? And I think that's a real problem, theologically, ethically, that we wrestle with. One of my colleagues runs immersion trips, and when I first went with him on one, in the beginning he was really resistant to even having cameras present, because there was some sense that this was robbing the dignity of the people, and he really wanted us to be there. So this is something I've wrestled with a lot in this project, and have written about it to some extent, about how do we not have this devolve into tourism, kind of poverty tourism, just collecting images so that we feel better. In a way, I'm thinking about the Facebook phenomenon, right, where you like something and feel like you've done some kind of moral action when you haven't done anything. You've done nothing, right? But you feel better because you have weighed in on something that is a challenging situation. the classic immersion photo, right, of a white kid from North America with some little person of color. And then that gets posted on Facebook, right? It's super hard to avoid these kind of pictures because my experience is these kids will just swarm you, right? And that happens, but we have recently told our students, even if you take these pictures and bring them home, don't put them on Facebook, right? Because that's not why you're there. For us, the main thing that we try to teach our students, and we, in a way, work to mitigate these challenges, we talk to them about needing to be present to these people, that they are there as witnesses, right? This is not something to check off their bucket list. We interview the students very carefully before we take them. We meet with them for several months before we go, doing reflections, educating them about what they're about to see. So in a way, we give them a lens through which they're going to view and interpret the experience they're about to have. And I think the most important thing we tell them, and I really do stress this, is that we're not going to change the world, and you're not going to change anything. What we really hope for is that they're going to be changed by the experience, and that maybe through the rest of their life, they can work for systematic change. So our project isn't quite a mission trip because we're not doing direct service, but it does have some of the same ambition as mission trips. We're wanting to expose students from a relatively privileged part of the world to the experience of students who come from a much less privileged part of the world. But we wanted to do that in some way that's transforming. And it can be very humbling, I think, for our students, as it was for me, to have this experience of meeting people in these very, very difficult circumstances who end up changing you far more than you impact them. And I think that's sort of what I'd like to leave us with and as the beginning of our conversation today. And I think I'm right at just about 10 minutes here. So thank you very much.
I think so. Just a bit about me. To put this in context, I was introduced to saying I take mission trips. There's a mission trip element to what I do. I take classes to Guatemala. I've been doing that since the year 2000, mostly here at St. Thomas. And I bet about half of all Minnesotan Christians have been to San Lucas Toliman. It sometimes feels that way. Anyway, how many of you have know about San Lucas Toliman and Guatemala? See, look, not half, but it's getting close as people put there. Anyway, so we go there. St. Thomas has had vision trips, which are mission trips. I take a class and we do some of the things that they do in vision with the vision trips. Then about halfway through the course, I have students read a famous speech by Ivan Illich called "To Hell with Good Intentions." If I had them read ahead of time, people might just get discouraged because Ivan Illich basically says volunteers go home. Now, he did this in 1968. Ivan Illich was a radical Austrian priest and philosopher, spent most of his career in Latin America, including the 1960s, the heady time when the whole world is talking about development. And so in 68, he addresses a group of volunteers that have invited him to come and talk because they know he's a bit of a provocateur. So my thesis, well, right now it's a fragment. Ivan Illich had a point, but what was that point? Maybe use this here. Even the best volunteers, he said, cannot help being ultimately vacationing salesmen for the middle-class American way of life, since that is really the only life you know. And he was talking to, if you read the speech, you can find it online, he was talking to people who were committed to be there at least for a few months, maybe years. And when we talk about mission trips, we're talking about weeks, sometimes days. How much more will that be true? Well, you be the judge. I want to tell you a little bit about a place I go. It's kind of the next fairly big city around Lake Atitlan, which is where San Lucas is, Santiago Atitlan. One of my, as my wife knows, one of my favorite places in the world. And one of the reasons to focus on Santiago rather than San Lucas, even though I've spent more of my time with students there, is that the Tzutujil Mayan Indian people who make up most of the population of Santiago are famous, even among other Mayan peoples, for their resistance to cultural impositions. Going back to the 16th century conquest, through the period of the Civil War in Guatemala, the repression, they achieved the first kind of demilitarized zone in Guatemala in 1990 or 91 by kind of rising up nonviolently against the repression, so on and so on. But I've seen changes in Santiago even in the last 20 years. And that's, oh, that is kind of working. And that's what I want to tell you about. And the last minute this morning, I threw together some pictures too, because it is kind of visual. Touchstone of changes, of the impact of globalization is the people's dress, the traditional garb. You know, Guatemala is famous, attracts tourists for the lovely weaving and so on and so on. This is a picture, I think, Easter morning at the church, and you can see, notice how many of the women are wearing traje, the typical clothing, and how many men are not. When I first started going to Santiago, most of the men were wearing traje. By now, it's less and less. And anthropologists say that around the world, given traditional stereotypical roles, stereotypical maybe for us, but deeply embedded for other peoples, difference in roles between men and women, one touchstone of changes, how much a group is having to assimilate, is how quickly the men and then the women start to adopt the clothing of the majority culture. Because men have more public roles, and so they will start to adopt those sooner. This is a marketplace photo. The man there is wearing a typical Santiago dress. Here's another photo of an older man and a child. But this is what it looks like most of the time by now. And again, I've watched this change just in the last 20 years. Group of men on a pickup truck, that's how people often get around. Western dress, the women still wearing the typical traje. Now, in a way, that's a trivial thing, but it's visible. So that's there are deeper reasons for that. It's not just cultural. These are bales and bales of used clothing that you and I have donated to Goodwill and so on, and the best gets sold, and the second best gets baled up and goes around the world and sold on the streets. Another dimension of globalization. This is also Guatemala. And just the economics of it, even women who are still wearing the typical skirts, with their weaving, well, it's so much cheaper to buy a blouse or an old T-shirt, on and on. So they can't keep, it takes a lot of work to do the stitching and so on for the embroidery. So people don't do it. And then going to another level, trying to get less and less superficial here. Here's a woman in a famous sweatshop, maquila, as they call it. The anthropologist, leading Latin American scholar, Linda Green, wrote in the early aughts, I think an article 2000, about the impact of rural industrialization on the Mayan culture. Bracket the whole question of whether the wages are fair and all of that. She charts the issues in terms of cultural change when people are taken out of their girls, young women, boys, young men, taken out of their traditional activities, travel, often have to leave at 4 in the morning, get back late at night to work in these factories, and how that breaks down the cultural transmission that goes with weaving, that goes with agriculture. And in addition to that, then, well, the point is, hopefully they're going to increase the cash in the families, raise their income, but then these young people are often tempted to, tempted for better and worse, I like my iPhone, my cell phone, but there are vendors hawking goods so that as soon as they get their check, they're buying, at the time in 2003, she said, cassettes and cassette players. Now it would be something else, or makeup or so on and so on. There's that pressure to adopt that middle-class American way of life. And it's coming from lots of places besides mission trip volunteers, obviously. It's only one factor. But it does give me, and has given me over the years, pangs of conscience. In academic, 2 minutes left. Okay, I got to keep moving. Maybe we can talk some more. This, an artist from Santiago says this. And again, remember, Tutuhil, famous for resisting the conquest, military repression. But he said a few years ago, culture is a much more subtle and powerful enemy. Many people in Santiago have cable TV because the national stations do not reach our town. So young people, rather than listening to Tutuhil music, prefer rap and heavy metal. They do not want to wear traditional clothing. They want designer sneakers and jeans. They don't want to speak Tutuhil, only Spanish and English. They're ashamed of their culture. I'm afraid that when our elders die, our culture will die with them unless we do something to stop this trend. What am I doing by taking students down to advertise that way of life? Well, there is one more layer I want to excavate. So we remember Illich's rebuke. I don't know how to weigh the difference between the effect of the military repression versus the cultural effect of globalization. But part of what was going on, and what has gone on in Guatemala for centuries, is that the Indians, the Mayan Indians, were seen as obstacles to modernization. If I had more time, I could trace that story. But even during the Civil War from the 50s into the 90s, one of the telling strategies was that the Guatemalan military set up model villages where they were going to try to westernize these Indians. That's part of the story, too. And part of how that then got resisted was foreign volunteers, the ones that Elich was rebuking, also were there documenting at great risk to themselves, trying to get the word out. Now, obviously, 21-year-olds from St. Thomas or Creighton or 15-year-olds from some of our parishes aren't going to be the ones to send into these dangerous zones, but people need to start somewhere in developing ties of solidarity. Working to relate to sometimes local people with a sense of dignity that they aren't getting from the majority culture themselves. So to finish up my fragmentary point, thesis, this is 2018, not 1968. It's tragically perhaps too late to avoid some of the dangers of globalization that he foresaw. So we need to harness the opportunities we have to create global networks that can strengthen respect for local cultures. Therefore, mission trips, no, they don't belong on bucket lists, I would argue, but because the whole bucket list mentality is the problem. That those people are out there to give me good experiences, and I need to tick them off. Mission trips can, however, be a way to weave networks of solidarity and initiate young people into them, if solidarity itself is the mission. Thank you.
Well, thank you, both of you, for the provocative remarks. I think it's pretty clear we could spend a few hours pushing more deeply into the conversation, and I think that's a successful effect on both of your parts. My impression, maybe, is, John, you reflected a little bit on the individual's experience in the Facebook post and sort of focused. And Gerald, I heard you speaking a little bit more at the systemic level in terms of middle-class cultures and cultural observations. And I wondered if that maybe isn't part of a way into the question about the challenge. That is, when you and I go on these mission trips and focus on individuals and their experiences, I think that threat of instrumentality can come in. But I will say my own experience is, when you're driving out of Tegucigalpa and you're heading up into the hills and you have a chance to circle back and look at the city and see miles and miles and miles of tin roofs and houses, that's not an encounter with an individual, that's an encounter with a system. When you're flying into Harare and you're looking out what looks to be a giant lake of glistening light, and it turns out it's miles and miles and miles of tin roof homes, that's not an encounter with an individual, that's a system. And so to me, I think the threat of instrumentalization maybe is a little bit more real at the individual level, where you feel like you're taking a photograph of someone suffering. It's kind of odd. But at the system level, to me, one of the fruits of the mission experience is that a lot of naivete is stripped away, and you come to the insight something has gone deeply wrong at a colossal level. This is not this man's failure or this family's failure. This is a systemic failure that creates this. Maybe the cultural or the class questions. That to me is, I thought, maybe one way to help get some insight or balance. I wonder what's your reactions. Then there'll be microphones circulating with Sean for your questions.
I turned this lav on. Is that actually functioning?
Working? Is that working?
It fell. That's the film. It's working too well.
I'm such a great filmmaker. I didn't even notice that. I kicked my own lav off. One of the things that bothers me, so I was like 40-something when I first went to the developing world. And it's not like I didn't know about that reality or believe in it. I just didn't know it. I knew it in here, but I didn't know it there. And it bothers me that I had to actually fly halfway around the world to wake myself up, right? And when there's similar kinds of poverty and struggle and systemic injustice only miles from where I live, and then one of the poorest places in the United States is about 5 hours away, you know. I was talking at lunch with Lisa. I think the poorest place in the Western Hemisphere next to Haiti is the Lakota Reservation in western South Dakota, right? But for some reason, for me, it was like, oh, I had to fly to Africa to see these problems. And I mean, this is a real resource problem. You know, we've got huge issues with carbon, and flying around the world is not sustainable. You know, so I think about things like that. But it can have that impact on people. It certainly did to me, and a lot of my students come away from these trips changed.
Yeah, you know, over the years going to Guatemala, San Lucas Toliman,
I think your mic's on. Oh, it is. Okay.
Is that better? I had a chance to talk with Father Greg Schaefer, late Father Greg Schaefer, who was the priest in San Lucas for 50 years, about some of these issues, and to kind of watch him in action, orienting volunteers there. And there's a sense in which he was instrumentalizing the gringos, the Americans, in a kind of savvy way. You know, most people are coming there with naive ideas that they're going to do a lot to help the people in 5 days time, or maybe a month or something. And he'd encourage them, and you know, you're doing great work here. And then he'd start to kind of, so he's kind of instrumentalizing those naive ideas about what we as Americans paternalistically can do, and then using that to start to raise consciousness. Tell them, well, but what you're really offering here is you're willing to take orders from Mayan Indian foremen on crews. That's something they never got from the majority. Ladino is what they call it in Guatemala, Hispanic. They're always looked down on, you know, so that's really what you're offering. Oh, and, you know, he'd go on and talk about, you know, how you can tell our stories. My wife and I had experience in a Honduras, well, Salvadoran refugees in Honduras in the 80s, and a woman who said, you know, we're stuck here, we can't get out until the war is over. So, ustedes son partícipes en nuestra voz. You are participants in our voice. We need you to take back our stories, to tell what's happening. So, yeah, that's.
Thanks. Questions from the floor? There's one.
Thanks. I have a question for both of you, maybe especially you, Dr. O'Keefe. How do you justify programs that tend to allow dependence on volunteers, such as Creighton's ILAC program? How does being a volunteer, how can you justify that you are sort of making it okay for the government to not help their own people, especially in medical things? I know that's something I struggle with, so what would be your response to that?
Yeah, so the ILAC program is it's a program in the Dominican Republic, and Creighton owns a center there, and it's mostly there's a medical center because we have a medical school, and then the College of Arts and Sciences actually runs a semester abroad program there that's a service learning semester. And I didn't say this in my presentation, but my actual first encounter with the developing world was in the Dominican Republic, because I went and taught there for 3 weeks. You know, I don't know. I mean, in a way, what you're pointing to is the problem. So part of it is a lot of these places they have no wealth. And you just see the inequality of the world sort of exposed in front of you. And so you're stuck with this problem of, do I do nothing and just count that up to the reality and say, well, they need to fend for themselves, or do I try to do something, you know? And I don't think there's any easy solution to that. It seems to me, though, that at least being aware of this challenge is very important, right? So one more thing is I went to the Democratic Republic of the Congo 5 years ago. It was 3 weeks in the central Congo, where they have nothing. I mean, no medical resource, no Western intervention. It was like going back into the Stone Age. No grid, no power system, no plumbing, no police force, nothing. And you know, you don't want that either. I mean, you want something to happen for these people. So I'm just going to leave you with the ambiguity. I don't know the answer. Yeah.
Gerald, you want to comment? I know it's specific to the ILAC program, but.
Well, I mean, as a teacher, a lot of times, introducing students to the tensions and at least turning them into creative tensions. It's what I do. It's what I do in Guatemala. It's what I do in the classroom here. Because you're dealing with some of the most complex issues on the globe. You know, to think that you would have an easy solution would be the cheekiest thing you could do. So.
Question, Billy?
Yeah, I guess, no.
Is that on?
Stand up at least, Billy.
So, is there, in overall, would you say there's greater student interest in going on mission trips to Guatemala and places like the Congo than there would be in going to places like South Dakota and Detroit and Appalachia, and whether that might have a kind of, might be permanent?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I didn't take students to the Congo. The university wouldn't let me. They almost wouldn't let me go. I had to sign my life away. But the question is fair. And actually, our trip, the border movie, 2 years ago, when my colleague Tom Kelly told me about this project and said he thought it would be good. And I said, no, it's not sexy enough. I mean, who wants to go to Arizona? You know, they want to go to Africa, they want to go to Alaska, you know, they want to go to Latin America. And he said, just come and see. And I did. Well, it turned out to be just as powerful. And I think, I know people in my own community, the Ignatian Associates, who were transformed by spending time on the reservation. So you don't have to go far. I think it has to do more with how you're formed and who are the people teaching you, and an openness to seeing what's there. It can be jolting to go far because you're vulnerable because of the foreignness of the moment. And that can open your heart, I think, in ways that is more difficult close to home, but not impossible.
Yeah, I guess I just was making a rather cynical point. Maybe really cynical point that students are going to be more open to some kind of a transformative experience with the other when that is taking place extremely far away from home, rather than when it's taking place extremely close to home. And then I'm just wondering, I wonder why that might be.
Well, I mean, you mean like in your own neighborhood?
Yeah. There's the adventure.
That's if that bucket list mentality is a reality, even if I'm not happy with it, at least I'm gonna, you know, inspired by Father Schaefer in Guatemala, I'm gonna at least instrumentalize it and try to take it a different direction. It's there, yeah. Be a little cynical, but don't get paralyzed by your cynicism. So, you know, as to the local versus overseas argument or issue, you know, I just point out in that famous speech by Ivan Illich, one of the few things he concedes, he says, okay, so you idealistic American volunteers in Mexico in the 1960s, you know, a time when there are racial issues at the forefront of the, you know, in Vietnam and so on. He says, if you want to be a volunteer, you know, go to your own probably says ghettos at the time, in '68 or whatever, and work there, work with people who can tell you to go to hell. And I know that's a crass here, but the point that I would make, even in Guatemala, and that even overseas, is find partners, host organizations and communities that have enough self-confidence that they're not going to tell you to go to hell, but they are, but because they're too imbued with an ethic of hospitality. But the point is, work with people who can be true partners because they have self-confidence, and find leaders who are good translators between cultures, bicultural enough that they'll have the courage to give you good guidance and so on.
Question in the back.
Yeah, my name is Mike Hazel. I work at the mission office at the Archdiocese, and we've led immersion trips, and I work also with parish partnerships that have partnerships between parishes here and parishes around the world. I have a question about, I have a number of questions. One is, it almost feels like that having individuals become changed by such experiences essentially justifies them. We also know that there's this huge thing called, some people have referred to as the chameleon effect. So you come back into our culture and you immediately, not immediately, but over a fairly short period of time, you become much more, you kind of put that experience on the shelf and you re-engage in this culture, and so that it becomes a memory and not what you said. If it's justified, if the way I heard it is, if it affects systemic change down the road. I mean, if you use that experience as a springboard for action to affect systemic change. My question would be, has there been much research done on that in terms of how short-term mission trips, like longitudinally looking at people who have gone on these trips and seeing whether they have in their lifetimes really embraced and engaged with systemic change? I mean, that would be a really obvious, important research thing to look into, and I just wonder what's out there in regard to that.
We had a meeting, we have these, our backpack journalism project is part of a group of short-term trips called FLIPAs, faculty-led programs abroad. Most of them are short-term trips to like Spain or France or things like this. And then a subset of them are trips like mine. But we had a meeting last week in which the associate dean, who's a sociologist, said she was going to send us an article that she had just read about the impact of these kinds of projects. And she said it was largely positive, that it can have a similar impact if done well as a semester abroad. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody who goes on them doesn't revert to just being sucked into the vortex of American consumerism. But it does at least open the possibility that some people won't. And as a Catholic and a Christian, I think the only way to really guard against that is community. That you need to be involved in the life of the church in some active way, and in a community that calls you to account. That would be my response to that.
I like that phrase about community that calls us to account. One question, last question in the back.
Our parish has a sister parish in Ghana, and every couple of years we send people there. But how do we get not just our people, but our hosts to stop looking at it as what are we going to do while we're there, because we're so busy doing that we don't have time to really engage with the individuals. And that's one of the things that I'm seeing as an issue.
Any thoughts about successful models for mission trips in terms of the balance between engagement and activity?
Well, I started by clarifying that I don't lead mission trips full stop. I lead a course that has a service learning, community engagement element inspired by the Vision program here. I mean, I don't want to just hold that up as a model, but the point is that it developed precisely out of that kind of anxiety, that we want to do more than just go there and be busy. You know, the idea was to take the Vision experience, which has been a good thing here at St. Thomas, kind of to the next level. I wasn't one of the designers of it. I got on board and have run with it for the last 15 or so years. But the initial idea behind this course was, you know, in a way it gives by making it a class. Now, obviously in a parish, maybe you have to find another way to do this, but set it up as a learning engagement from the beginning, so that people have less, I mean, my first conversation with Father Greg Schaefer, I said, I want you to know we're not going to have as much time as the Vision trips or the other volunteers who come to be working. We're only going to be working mornings, and then we need to have class afternoons. And he said, oh, that's fine. That's really what this is about. You know, it's really about education. So calling it a learning experience from the beginning gives people permission to not feel like they have to just work all the time, because they're supposed to make the most of their time and the cost of their airplane tickets and so on and so on.
I think that's going to be more or less our time this afternoon, and I want to thank our panelists for sharing their reflections. Very provocative. It's just essentially a prompt for deeper conversation among ourselves. John, I was struck by your remark about being members of community and members of community that call us to account, and Gerald, your observations that the mission itself has really got to be about solidarity. You think about how many times Pope Francis has spoken of the importance of accompaniment, and in a certain sense what we're doing is challenging ourselves to not just simply be passive observers of the circumstances around us, but to accompany and become in solidarity or ecclesially in communion with those communities that we find ourselves in. And the opportunities to sort of step out of our familiarity isn't just obviously across the globe, but it's here in our own communities. And it's a great call to conscience as a university professor and part of a university program to be attentive to our mission as teachers and professors, to encourage that in ourselves and in our students, to move to those margins and to move to those edges in a spirit of solidarity and in communion and in accompaniment that Pope Francis is constantly calling us to. So I think I'm going to make an announcement about the next event, and then we will conclude with a raucous applause. The upcoming events for Murphy Institute, reading Dante's Comedy as Theology, a symposium on March 8th here at the University of St. Thomas, I think under the tutelage and capable leadership of Billy Junker, who was speaking earlier. If you would like more information about participating, please contact Dr. Junker. We're also going to be doing an... Go to the website. Billy's a little shy. Go to the website. The other event has to do with art and the celebration of song, love, art, and the deepest desires. It's going to be an evening of reflection on music and the meditations and the work of Sister Helen Prejean. It will be at Our Lady of Lourdes Catholic Church in Minneapolis. Finally, given the season, there'll be discussion of the U.S. tax system and the hot topic and cool talk. Should the U.S. tax system be used as a tool to fix income inequality? That's Friday, April 13th. Those are the events that are coming forward. And Murphy, thank you so much for joining us today, and let's thank our panel.